The chandeliers in the Lexington Hotel's grand ballroom sparkled like stars suspended from a golden sky. Warm light cascaded over the polished walnut floors and mirrored walls, dancing across the crystal glasses and polished silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. It was Boston's most exclusive charity gala of the year, $5,000 a plate, and the guest list read like a who's who of New England's old money and new power. Women arrived draped in designer gowns, Versace, Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera, many of which cost more than a year's tuition at Harvard. Diamonds shimmered on wrists and necklines, and the soft rustle of silk filled the air like a secret whispered from wealth to wealth. The men were no less impressive in their tailored tuxedos and patent leather shoes, each handshake paired with a business card tucked behind a tight smile. Standing near the grand staircase was Charlotte Whitmore, regal in a deep emerald satin dress, her platinum blonde hair sculpted to perfection. To her left was Evelyn Grant, sipping a glass of vintage Chardonnay, and to her right, Pamela Dawson, whose navy blue ensemble glittered with silver beading. The trio, dubbed by some as the social set, had been fixtures at Boston's high society events for over 2 decades. "I hope the new pediatric wing is named after someone with some class this time," Charlotte muttered under her breath, glancing at the donor recognition wall from last year. Last year's top donor was a tech startup guy from Minnesota. Hardly legacy. The other 2 women nodded, offering polite but knowing laughs. Just then, a hush of curiosity moved through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. A woman had entered through the side doors, alone. No entourage, no valet trailing behind with a wrap or clutch. She wore a plain beige dress that fell just below her knees, made of some soft, unassuming fabric. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a modest twist, and she wore no noticeable jewelry save for a thin gold band on her right hand. Emma Sanders, 34, walked with a calm grace that seemed almost at odds with the glittering chaos around her. She paused in front of the architectural display showing renderings of the hospital's planned expansion, her eyes scanning the blueprints with quiet intensity. Charlotte arched a perfectly plucked brow. Who invited her? God only knows, Evelyn whispered, not bothering to lower her voice. She looks like she's here for a job interview, not a black tie fundraiser. Pamela chuckled. I haven't seen beige like that since my housekeeper's uniform in the 80s. But Emma remained unaware, or perhaps unbothered, by the snickers around her. She took a glass of water from a passing server, offered a genuine smile, and continued reading the information about the pediatric oncology unit. None of the women could have guessed that behind Emma's modest dress and quiet demeanor was a story more powerful than any trust fund or designer label in the room, a story that, by the end of the night, would unravel their assumptions, shake the room's social order, and redefine what it truly meant to be worthy. Emma Sanders stood near the edge of the ballroom, quietly observing the crowd as she sipped her water. The murmur of conversations, politics, real estate, Ivy League legacies, buzzed around her like bees drawn to privilege. She lingered by the display highlighting the hospital's new pediatric oncology wing, pausing to study the garden plans included in the blueprint. She smiled gently at the thought of the little girl she'd met that morning, a frail 8-year-old named Sophie who had asked whether butterflies would be allowed in the new garden. Not far away, Charlotte Whitmore and her companions had turned their attention fully to Emma. She's still here, Pamela murmured, her voice edged with amusement. And she hasn't moved from that display in 10 minutes. Charlotte didn't respond right away. She watched Emma with narrowed eyes, lips pursed thoughtfully. Do you think she's part of the hospital staff? Maybe PR? Or worse, media? She doesn't even have a name badge, Evelyn added, tilting her head slightly. Honestly, I think someone made a mistake. They must have opened up the guest list to volunteers or something. Charlotte smirked. Well, someone clearly forgot to run her outfit past the dress code committee. That dress couldn't cost more than $100. Maybe less, Pamela chimed in. Looks like she got it on clearance at a department store in the suburbs. The women laughed quietly, their manicured hands wrapped around crystal champagne flutes, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to whether Emma overheard. Emma, for her part, turned and walked slowly toward the beverage table, her posture poised, her face serene. She was well aware of the stares and whispers. In her life, she'd learned that silence could often speak louder than rebuttals, and grace under pressure was a language that only the wise understood. Charlotte, emboldened by the wine and the safety of her clique, approached with a saccharine smile. I don't believe we've met. I'm Charlotte Whitmore. I serve on the hospital's executive fundraising board. Emma extended her hand with warmth. Emma Sanders. Lovely to meet you. Charlotte's gaze subtly scanned Emma's outfit, looking for any hint of couture, a familiar brand, even a tasteful brooch, anything to anchor her in their world. Finding nothing, she pressed on. And what brings you to our little gathering? Are you with the hospital? No, Emma replied simply, just a supporter of children's healthcare. Well, Charlotte said, her tone as smooth as velvet over a dagger, every little bit helps. From behind, Evelyn and Pamela drew closer, circling like elegant sharks in designer heels. The guest list this year must have expanded, Evelyn offered, swirling her champagne. It's usually quite selective. Emma nodded politely. I received an invitation. The pediatric oncology wing is close to my heart. Pamela raised a skeptical brow. Oh? Did someone in your family receive care here? Before Emma could answer, Dr. Jonathan Harris, the hospital's chief of pediatrics, appeared beside her with a wide smile. Miss Sanders. I didn't expect to see you tonight. Thank you again for visiting the children this morning. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about your butterfly garden idea. The other women blinked in confusion as Emma smiled and replied, it was an honor. Charlotte's grip tightened on her glass, her practiced smile faltering for the first time. There was something unsettling about Emma's quiet confidence, something that made them all begin to wonder if, perhaps, they had misjudged the woman standing in the beige dress. While much of the ballroom buzzed with social chatter and subtle status games, Emma Sanders found herself once again drawn to the architectural models of the hospital's new pediatric oncology wing. The renderings showed bright, child-friendly designs, open spaces with natural light, murals with animal themes, and an outdoor garden designed to give young patients a view beyond hospital walls. Emma studied every detail with a seriousness that contrasted sharply with the clinking of champagne flutes and the talk of vacation homes on Nantucket. Her fingers gently brushed over a labeled section called Therapy Garden, and her eyes paused at a corner feature, a proposed butterfly terrace. She smiled, remembering Sophie's question that morning, will there be flowers for butterflies? And Emma's promise that the new wing would have a garden just for them. Earlier that day, Emma had spent over 3 hours touring the hospital. She didn't simply shake hands or pose for photos. She sat at bedsides, read picture books aloud, and knelt to eye level when talking to the children. She asked nurses about patient turnover rates and infection control protocols. She listened more than she spoke. One mother had quietly pulled Emma aside near the nurse's station. Her toddler was undergoing his second round of chemotherapy. We're grateful just to have a window in the room, she said. He likes to watch the squirrels in the trees. It calms him. Emma had taken that to heart. She'd made a note on her phone, ensure all pediatric rooms have outdoor views. Nature heals. Back at the gala, her attention was interrupted by the familiar voice of Dr. Jonathan Harris, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. He approached with genuine warmth. "Miss Sanders," he said, extending his hand, "I'm glad you made it tonight." Charlotte Whitmore, Evelyn Grant, and Pamela Dawson, still hovering nearby, perked up. "You two know each other?" Charlotte asked, clearly surprised. Dr. Harris chuckled. "Of course. Miss Sanders spent the morning with us. She asked some of the most insightful questions I've heard from any donor, or board member, for that matter." Emma offered a modest smile. "I just wanted to understand what the children and staff truly need." Pamela's brow furrowed. "You visited the oncology ward?" "Yes," Emma said. "I spoke with the nurses, patients, and a few families. It's important to me that the design reflects more than architecture, it should reflect compassion." Evelyn glanced sideways at Charlotte, sensing a shift in tone. This wasn't someone who was merely curious. Emma was invested, emotionally, mentally, perhaps even financially. "Well," Charlotte said with a forced chuckle, "we wouldn't want to overwhelm you with technicalities. These events can be a bit much for newcomers." "I'm not overwhelmed," Emma replied kindly. "But I do believe the children deserve more than sterile walls and harsh lighting. Their environment should offer comfort, beauty, even. That's not technical. That's human." Her words, spoken without pretense, hung in the air. The women, used to empty pleasantries and performative philanthropy, didn't quite know how to respond. Emma wasn't here to impress or network. She was here because she cared deeply. And in a room full of people dressed to be seen, her quiet purpose had just become impossible to ignore. As the evening wore on, the ballroom grew quieter in anticipation. The room's lighting dimmed slightly, drawing attention to the stage at the front where the hospital's executive director, Richard Thornton, stood with a microphone in hand. His tuxedo was crisp, his voice well-rehearsed, charismatic in a way that suggested years of board meetings and fundraising dinners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying smoothly over the marble and mahogany, "tonight is more than a gathering of generosity, it's a turning point for our hospital, and especially for our youngest patients." Scattered applause followed. Charlotte Whitmore leaned in toward Evelyn and whispered, "Here we go. Let's see if Montgomery Wells donated again. He loves a good photo op with the mayor." Thornton continued, "Each year, we are humbled by the compassion of our supporters. But this year, something extraordinary happened." A murmur stirred the room like a ripple across still water. "For the first time in our hospital's 150-year history," Thornton said, pausing for effect, "we received a single, anonymous donation of $25 million, earmarked specifically for the pediatric oncology wing." Gasps. Audible gasps. Charlotte sat upright in her seat. "$25 million, she whispered, eyes wide. "That has to be a mistake. No one keeps that kind of gift quiet." Evelyn furrowed her brow. "Who would even?" Thornton raised a hand. "While we always respect our donors' wishes to remain private, this individual graciously allowed us to acknowledge them tonight. Because they're here, in this very room." The silence was immediate and total. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Emma Sanders, standing quietly in the back of the room near the donor display, glanced down at the floor, then slowly looked up. "This person is not only a benefactor," Thornton said, "but also someone whose life was once forever changed within our hospital walls. At just 12 years old, she was a patient here, fighting a battle no child should ever face." Charlotte's head turned sharply toward Emma. "Her journey through illness inspired a lifelong commitment to healing others," Thornton continued. "Through the Sanders Foundation for Pediatric Medical Research, she has funded groundbreaking advancements across the country. Charlotte, pale now, turned to Pamela. Did he say Sanders Foundation? Then came the words that would hang in Boston society for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking and welcoming tonight's lead donor, Miss Emma Sanders. All eyes swiveled toward the woman in the beige dress. Emma moved gracefully through the stunned crowd. Her modest heels tapped gently on the walnut floors, the soft fabric of her dress brushing against glittering gowns and tuxedos as she passed. No entourage, no dramatic flair, just quiet confidence. On stage, she accepted the microphone with a polite nod. I was once a little girl in a hospital bed, she began, her voice steady. I remember the walls, the machines, the fear, but more than that, I remember the kindness. That kindness saved me. Applause broke like a wave, rolling through the room with growing force. Charlotte sat frozen, champagne glass trembling in her hand. In that moment, every whisper, every judgment, every assumption she'd made about Emma Sanders came crashing down, and the real power in the room had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with heart. The applause had barely faded when Emma Sanders stepped away from the podium. She left behind not just a legacy-defining speech, but an entire ballroom stunned into silence. Even the string quartet, stationed near the back of the room, missed their cue to resume playing. For a long breath, all anyone could do was watch her descend the stage. Emma, still in her simple beige dress, had just dismantled an entire social hierarchy, without ever raising her voice or lifting her chin. Near the front of the ballroom, Charlotte Whitmore stared, unblinking, as Emma returned to the floor. The clink of her champagne flute was absent now. Her carefully constructed composure, a fortress built over years of cotillions, fundraisers, and high society luncheons, had a visible crack. She's the Emma Sanders, Pamela Dawson whispered, trying to piece together what they'd just witnessed. The Sanders Foundation, Evelyn Grant murmured. As in Sanders Medical Tech? The imaging company? Charlotte nodded stiffly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her clutch to pull out her phone. A quick search confirmed everything. Emma was the only daughter of Robert and Margaret Sanders, pioneers in medical imaging technology who had died tragically in a plane crash over a decade earlier. Emma had inherited not just their fortune, but their philanthropic spirit, and she'd chosen to multiply it quietly, without fanfare or public recognition. 25 million, Charlotte said under her breath. And we treated her like she was a wedding crasher. All around them, the shift was palpable. Just moments ago, Emma had been a nobody in the eyes of Boston's elite, an oddity in off-the-rack fabric. Now, people they had known for years were angling toward her with fresh smiles and suddenly gracious expressions. Hospital board members, once dismissive, now tried to make polite conversation with her. Donors who had previously whispered behind their hands now leaned forward with enthusiasm, as if they'd always known who she was. The tide had turned, and Emma stood at its center, unmoved, unshaken. Dr. Jonathan Harris joined her again, grinning. I wanted to see their faces when they realized, he admitted, only half joking. Emma gave a soft chuckle. That wasn't the point, you know. Maybe not, he replied, but you certainly made it. As they spoke, Charlotte mustered the courage to approach, flanked by Evelyn and Pamela. Their practiced smiles were back, but this time they didn't reach their eyes. Miss Sanders, Charlotte began, her tone sugary and contrite. What a wonderful surprise this has been. Had we known of your connection to the hospital? But you didn't, Emma interrupted gently. And that's rather the point, isn't it? Charlotte faltered. We may have misunderstood. Emma smiled with genuine warmth but unwavering clarity. You didn't misunderstand. You assumed. Around them, the room resumed its rhythm. But for Charlotte, Evelyn, and Pamela, something fundamental had shifted. Their carefully calibrated world, one where status was signaled through labels and lineage, had just been dismantled by a woman in a dress without a single designer tag. Emma had proven, without needing to say it outright, that true power didn't need to be worn. It only needed to be lived. As the buzz from Emma's shocking reveal began to subside, anticipation rose again across the ballroom. The evening's final moment had arrived, the unveiling of the donor recognition wall, a tradition that immortalized the hospital's top contributors in bronze and brushed steel. It was, for many in the room, the pinnacle of social validation. A name etched into that wall signified more than generosity. It was a permanent seat at Boston's elite table. Richard Thornton, the hospital's executive director, returned to the stage, his voice solemn. "Tonight, we honor those whose remarkable generosity will shape the lives of our children for generations to come." Guests gathered near the velvet-draped plaque on the far wall, waiting to see whose names had been inscribed at the top. Champagne glasses were topped off. Phones were discreetly readied for photos. Charlotte, Evelyn, and Pamela stood close together, unsure whether to approach Emma again, uncertain now where they stood. "And now," Thornton continued, "we present the names of those who made this expansion possible." He pulled the covering aside. A collective breath was held. Then, a wave of murmurs. At the very top of the wall, where everyone expected to see Emma Sanders engraved in bold lettering, there was no name. Instead, a simple inscription read, "In honor of Sophie and all children fighting battles beyond their years. Your courage inspires our commitment." The room fell quiet. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Thornton looked out at the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "At the request of our lead benefactor, Miss Sanders, her name will not appear on this wall. She asked that the spotlight remain not on her, but on the children we serve." There was silence at first. Then, slowly, scattered applause began. It swelled into something deeper, an acknowledgement not of wealth, but of humility. Standing off to the side, Emma remained calm, hands folded gently in front of her. When Thornton motioned to her, she stepped forward and spoke briefly. "When I was a patient here at 12 years old," she said, "I didn't know the names on the donor walls. But I remembered the butterfly stickers on my four-pole. The nurse who braided my hair. The small kindnesses that made me feel like more than a diagnosis." She paused, her eyes moving across the audience. "I want today's children to feel seen. To know they matter, not because someone rich gave them something, but because someone cared enough to see them as people first." Her words landed with quiet force. In the back of the crowd, Charlotte looked down at the floor, her own reflection faint in the polished wood. Evelyn dabbed at her eyes discreetly, and Pamela's hands trembled slightly, no longer from embarrassment, but realization. Emma had been offered legacy, prestige, and permanent recognition. And she had declined them all. Not out of modesty, but out of conviction. Later that evening, Thornton confided to a colleague, "In all my years running this hospital, I've never seen anything like that. The most powerful donor in our history, and she gave away the spotlight." And in doing so, Emma Sanders became something far greater than wealthy. She became unforgettable. 6 months had passed since the night that reshaped Boston's social scene and left a quiet mark on Charlotte Whitmore's heart. It was early spring now, and sunshine filtered gently through the broad windows of the newly completed Sophie's Butterfly Haven, the garden terrace designed especially for the hospital's youngest cancer patients. The space was filled with flowering plants, coneflowers, milkweed, black-eyed Susans, all chosen to attract butterflies. Wind chimes tinkled softly from shepherd's hooks, and paved paths wound gracefully through the beds, wide enough for wheelchairs and 4 poles. Charlotte stood at the edge of the garden, watching as Sophie, now healthier and full of life, guided her wheelchair toward a cluster of purple blooms. She was followed closely by Emma Sanders, who bent down to point out a monarch drying its wings in the morning sun. "She told me this is her favorite place in the world," said a voice beside Charlotte. It was Dr. Jonathan Harris, holding a clipboard and looking out over the scene with quiet pride. "She earned it," Charlotte replied, her voice softer now, grounded. "They all have." Few would have believed the transformation Charlotte had undergone since that night. The woman once known for chairing social galas and managing charity guest lists now spent her mornings coordinating patient family services and helping develop the hospital's sibling support program, an initiative to help brothers and sisters of young patients process the trauma and upheaval of illness. She still wore pearls, but now they were paired with comfortable flats and navy cardigans instead of satin and stilettos. "I'll be honest," she said, turning to Dr. Harris, "at first, I came back here just to save face. To feel less ashamed. But somewhere along the way, I actually started to care. And once you start caring, it's hard to stop." Dr. Harris smiled. "That's how it begins for a lot of us." Not far away, Emma knelt beside a young boy adjusting a butterfly feeder. Charlotte watched her carefully. In 6 months, she had come to admire Emma more deeply than she ever thought possible. Not for her wealth, but for her presence, for her steady refusal to make things about herself. Later that day, as hospital staff and families gathered for the garden's dedication, Charlotte stood beside Emma at the edge of the crowd. Sophie and a few other children sang a short, cheerful song, and a nurse handed Emma a small plaque to place near the entrance. It read, "A place for wonder, rest, and hope. For every child, and every heart that dares to heal." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Charlotte turned to Emma. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "Not just for that night, but for a lifetime of seeing people for what they wore, instead of who they were." Emma gave her a kind smile. "You've already apologized. And besides, you've done something far more meaningful, you've changed." Charlotte nodded, glancing toward the garden, her eyes reflecting something deeper than remorse. "I used to think purpose came from being important," she said. "Now I know, it comes from being useful." And in that quiet moment, amid flowers and laughter and flitting wings, a friendship began, not built on status or pedigree, but on something far more enduring, shared humanity. The spring sun bathed the courtyard in a soft, golden hue as birds chirped from nearby trees and butterflies drifted lazily through the blooms of Sophie's butterfly haven. The grand opening had passed, the speeches were over, and now the space had become what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary of joy, healing, and hope. Emma Sanders sat quietly on a wooden bench near the center of the garden, watching as a nurse guided a young boy with a walker toward a patch of wildflowers. His eyes lit up as a monarch landed gently on a blossom inches from his fingers. Across the path, Charlotte Whitmore approached slowly, holding a small cup of lemonade. No designer dress, no high heels, just slacks, a cotton blouse, and the warmth of someone learning how to live with both feet firmly planted in the soil of reality. She sat down beside Emma, smiling softly. "They're calling Sophie the butterfly girl now," she said, glancing toward the little girl who was twirling her wheelchair in circles, giggling with another patient. Emma nodded. "She's earned the title." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of children laughing, wind in the chimes, and bees humming through the air between them. "I used to think philanthropy was about money," Charlotte said, breaking the quiet. "Who gave the most? Whose name was carved into a wall? But this feels different." Emma looked at her gently. It is different. This isn't about how much you give. It's about why. Charlotte turned toward her, her voice sincere. You could have claimed every bit of the spotlight, Emma. You earned it. But you chose not to. Emma's gaze shifted to the children playing in the garden. They're the ones who deserve the light. Not me. Charlotte took a slow sip of her lemonade. My husband still doesn't understand why I've stepped away from all the social committees. Yesterday he asked when I'm coming back to the country club brunch circuit. Emma chuckled. What did you tell him? I told him I'm too busy helping launch a sibling grief program for families who've lost a child, Charlotte replied, her voice steady. He blinked twice and didn't say a word. They both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes only from shared growth and hard-earned perspective. A few minutes later, Sophie rolled up to them, a butterfly perched delicately on her index finger. Look, she whispered with awe. She's not scared. Emma leaned down and smiled. Butterflies land where they feel safe. Sophie beamed. Just like me. Charlotte's eyes welled with unexpected tears. She looked at Emma and said softly, You've changed more than just this garden. You've changed me. And probably a lot of people in that ballroom that night. Emma placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's. Sometimes, she said, it just takes one person to see things differently for others to start seeing differently too. As the late morning light filtered through the fluttering wings and the garden bloomed in full color, it became clear this wasn't about social standing, fashion labels, or bank accounts. It was about humanity. And in that space of transformation, surrounded by children whose very lives embodied resilience, the richest woman in the room had become the humblest and the most impactful. In a world that often equates worth with wealth, appearances, and social standing, Emma Sanders' story gently reminds us of a deeper truth. Our real value lies not in what we wear, own, or project, but in how we treat others. Her quiet strength, humility, and compassion challenge those around her to see beyond the surface and remember that dignity is not reserved for the privileged. For many older adults who have lived through changing times and shifting values, this story may strike a familiar chord, the realization that life's most meaningful moments often come not from recognition, but from connection. As we age, it becomes clearer that kindness, purpose, and authenticity are far more enduring than accolades or outward status. Whether we're volunteering, mentoring, supporting our families, or simply showing up for someone in need, those quiet acts of love and service often leave the deepest impact. Emma chose to uplift others instead of seeking applause, and in doing so, she inspired transformation. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to shift our perspective, to live with more heart, and to choose substance over spectacle. Because in the end, the legacy we leave behind is written not on walls, but in people's lives.